welcome to Thomson Reuters Talks Financial Crime. I'm your host, Gina Jurva, attorney and manager of market insights and thought leadership here at the Thomson Reuters Institute. So the U.S. Congress enacted a long-awaited strengthening of the country's anti-money laundering laws on January 1st, as it adopted an annual defense spending bill over a presidential veto. The overhaul is considered the biggest change in the U.S. anti-money laundering framework since the 2001 USA Patriot Act, which was enacted in response to the 9/11 attacks that year. Joining me today is Brett Wolfe to talk about the new Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2020. And Brett Wolfe is a senior financial crimes correspondent, anti-money laundering correspondent at Regulatory Intelligence, and a return guest on our show. So Brett, it is always a pleasure to have you on. Thank you for joining us today.
Great to be with you.
So Brett, I mean, this law is really big news, to say the least. Can you just walk us through what is changing here as it relates to anti-money laundering legislation?
Well, sure. I would start off by saying there are a litany of changes, very extensive, and it's going to take some time for Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network to kind of work through all of these changes and implement them. So it's not as if this is going to happen overnight, but there's a whole lot that needs to be done. One overarching goal of this is to improve coordination and information sharing among the U.S. agencies that are tasked with administering AML requirements. And it even in addition to requiring, bolstered domestic cooperation on the anti-money laundering front, it even requires taking steps to bolster international AML cooperation. So it's very much focused around information sharing and greater cooperation. And there are a lot of agencies, from regulators to Treasury Department to intelligence agencies, regulators, so many different entities that are going to have a hand in this and going to be required to have some level of involvement. The real goal, the end goal, is to allow the U.S. government and financial institutions to better respond to new and emerging threats, to make better use of technology in the fight against financial crime, and to ensure that the steps banks are required to take are truly based on risk, so that they provide the best possible information to law enforcement. They want to really focus on the threats. So another element is requiring government agencies to provide priorities, to make those clear, spell those out to financial institutions, so that they can be sure that they're addressing risk and getting the information that law enforcement needs into their hands, as opposed to perhaps making filings that are more defensive in nature and not of great use to law enforcement that kind of clutter the system. Of course, one of the most well-publicized elements of this AML Act of 2020 would require the creation of a beneficial ownership registry, so that at the time of incorporations, companies would have to reveal the true or beneficial owners that are behind the companies. This would address a long-standing law enforcement concern that it was very difficult in some cases to determine who the people were who were behind entities that were incorporated in states such as Delaware and others, due to a lack of transparency. But I mean, the law goes a lot further and takes steps such as requiring the creation of 2 new subcommittees of the so-called Bank Secrecy Act Advisory Group, which is a body that consists of federal regulators, law enforcement agencies, financial institutions, and trade groups that get together and discuss anti-money laundering issues and steps that need to be taken. But these 2 new subcommittees would focus on innovation and technology and information security and confidentiality. The latter, information security and confidentiality, may in part be an outgrowth of the so-called FinCEN files, wherein very sensitive information was leaked or made its way from Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network into the hands of investigative reporters, and really created some concerns for financial institutions that had filed these reports. So I think it was clear that the steps needed to be taken to address widespread concern about the various data that banks are providing to the government. And in this case, we're going to see, obviously, various entities providing this beneficial ownership information to the government. And everyone understands that this information needs to be kept secure. So that's going to be, obviously, another priority of this law. The law would also create a new whistleblower program that would provide greater rewards and protections to those who report money laundering violations. Some consider that a very major element of this law. The law also requires FinCEN to take steps to enhance information sharing between law enforcement and bankers, which would address a long-standing concern amongst banks that they file these suspicious activity reports, but they get very little feedback in terms of the value of that information and whether it's what law enforcement needs. So, it's important, obviously, that there be a line of communication so that everyone is on the same page in terms of what information is needed, how it should be provided. And this law certainly pushes forward in that direction. And I would close by saying one final aspect of this that is of great interest to financial institutions is this law gives FinCEN expanded authority to subpoena the records of foreign financial institutions that hold correspondent accounts in the United States. This will be a boon to U.S. law enforcement in terms of its ability to get their hands on information held by foreign banks, but undoubtedly will create concerns for those foreign banks, some of which operate in jurisdictions with fairly strict privacy laws. So there is absolutely a whole lot going on right now as a result of the AML Act of 2020.
Yeah, and I mean, there's so much, and so much we could really dive into. I mean, I think we could do several hours of a webinar on it. It's a lot of information, and I know we're going to talk a little bit more in the coming episodes on the beneficial ownership in particular, and dive into that, the registry. But in general, you talk to a lot of different people in the industry. How are these changes being received by the financial institutions, and government officials? Like, are these welcome changes? Because my understanding is that they've been wanting these changes for a very long time.
Yes, I would say everyone is excited about this. I mean, in the financial services industry, many of these items are things they have been asking for years. So I think they see this as sort of the culmination of all of their lobbying and other efforts to get a lot of this information sharing and feedback that they've long been looking for. I think law enforcement is very excited about this. They have long been very concerned about the lack of information about beneficial owners of companies because in some cases that leads to dead-end investigations. So they're excited. I think probably FinCEN and maybe some of the regulators, they have a lot of work ahead of them. So I think their reaction might be one of preparing themselves for the long haul and for a lot of hard work. But overall, the only criticisms that I really hear are, why did this take so long?
Sure.
And, there are some elements that some would have liked to have seen included that weren't, largely based on criticisms from the Financial Action Task Force, the international AML standard setter, such as the fact that the AML Act of 2020 does not address the fact that lawyers in the United States do not have any obligation to report suspicious activity to authorities, unlike in certain other countries, especially in Europe. And
which is such an important It's an important criticism, I would imagine.
It is, and I think it will be ongoing. But it's, I think there's acceptance that it's going to be very difficult to see movement in that area in the United States due to the lobby that certain groups have within Congress.
Brett, thank you as always for joining me. Brett Wolf, Senior Financial Crimes and Anti-Money Laundering Correspondent at Thomson Reuters Regulatory Intelligence. Brett, thank you for being on.
Happy to be here.